Before the next episode of X Job Downloaded starts, I have a big favour to ask. If you've enjoyed any of our episodes so far, please can you click on the follow button on your platform. I'm on Apple, Spotify, Google, Amazon and YouTube. It costs nothing to follow, but makes a real difference to me as a podcast producer. Thank you. My name is Paul Maleary, and for 30 years I served with Essex Police. During this time I interviewed suspects for murder, abduction, rape and extortion, plus a variety of other crimes. Now I interview former police and military personnel and anybody else who has an interesting story to tell. Sit back and listen to X Job Downloaded. This episode is sponsored by LifeSafe Technologies' Stay Safe All-in-One Fire Extinguisher. Click on the link in the body of the text to buy your fire extinguisher today. This interview is being tape recorded. My name is Paul Maleary and this is X Job Downloaded, and today I'm going to interview Will Blackburn. Now, Will is an author, a former army reservist, and he resides in Poland. He's doing some great work in relation to the Ukraine or the Ukrainian issues. Good afternoon to you.
Afternoon, Paul.
How are you, mate?
I'm very well. It's funny enough, as you mentioned, I mean, I am, I suppose, an author because I've written a book about Ukraine. But just before we spoke, I was sort of doing the day job, which is software stuff. And it's always good to do a bit of day job because it keeps you grounded and make sure you don't annoy the colleagues too much. Because I spend a lot of time doing Ukraine stuff.
Absolutely. And because you're a director of your own company now and all the things that go with that, which we'll discuss. But where did it all begin for you, and what was your inspiration to join the Royal Military Police?
It was years, gosh, it's a long time ago now. I have to sort of think back. But back in the days, very late 90s, early noughties, I actually joined the London Regiment, which was an infantry regiment. And talking to various people, they said, look, if you want to do lots of different things, you're probably better off joining the RMP. Not that there's anything wrong with London Regiment, and there's lots of super people there. But the RMP, based in Brixton, a lot of people from the Met and quite a few of the sort of surrounding home county services, police services. So they brought a lot of really interesting knowledge from their civilian police activities, but also many of them had served in the RMP previously. And to that end, it was always interesting. There was always a lot of everything from an evening learning about forensics through to how to run a convoy and everything in between. And then, of course, 2003, Iraq pops up. And as with a lot of the territorial army, as was then, it's now, I believe, called the Army Reserve. They said, right, we are mobilizing members of this unit to serve on Telic, and it was staggered. So I served on what was called Telic 3, which Telic was the code name for Iraq. And yes, did a 6-month tour of duty in and around Basra, which was quite interesting to say the least.
I bet it was. Were you out there when the guys got killed, Hamilton Jewell and all the chaps from 156?
We were the tour just after, and it was at that stage people were very mindful of the fact of obviously what had happened, but also was it the RMP that were being specifically targeted? That was one of the theories at that stage. I think that turned out to not be the case. It was just hugely unfortunate. But there were two incidents. There was the incident up in Mesan where 6 RMP lost their lives, and then actually very shortly after that there was the incident in Basra itself where another 3 RMP lost their lives. So it was a very strange time to go over. It was very sobering. And I remember a lot of the pre-deployment training was very focused on contact drills, and in some ways very different from perhaps other RMP tours that had happened prior to that. So it was a very strange time for the RMP. I think it very much more involved with the kinetic side of things, and But
it was a very kinetic tour anyway, wasn't it? I mean, Telic, it was continual. It wasn't just a one-off, and the RMP weren't the only corps regiment to suffer casualties. It was something that was happening across all the regiments, whether it's paras or whoever.
Yeah.
Where did you do your basic training, and what was that like for you? What were you doing in Civvy Street at that time?
Civvy Street, I was working again, still in software, and funnily enough, working for the bloke who ended up publishing my book.
Oh, wow.
That's a whole story in itself. And yes, basic training was done at Pirbright, which, talking to very old veterans or not so old veterans, I should be careful what I say. Of course, for them, Pirbright was a guards depot, or had been the guards depot.
Yeah.
And so it was, when I mentioned, sometimes if anyone asks where I've been or done basic training, say Pirbright, they often think it's I was in the guards or whatever, but no, it was at that stage. I believe it had become part of the Royal Logistics Corps training depot,
right.
And they were running TA basic training, which involved lots of different TA regiments. So it was a classic case of, when you arrived, obviously I was badged at that stage as AGC, Adjutant General's Corps.
Yeah.
And then there were people from signals, people from artillery, you name it. So it was a very, very mixed group of people. But the focus on the basic training, it very much changed. I remember joining the TA when it was still a little bit Dad's army. There were people who'd done tours of Bosnia and former Yugoslavia. But when I went through basic training, it was very much that the world's changing, and this is serious stuff. And we were put through our paces. It obviously not as intense as the regular service, and very much with a view that was ongoing training with units afterwards. But it was a very, very good training. I obviously, as with all training like that, there are stresses and strains, but I look back on it very fondly, and a lot of the skills actually that learned on basic training stood me in very good stead out in Iraq, obviously, but still, when I go to Ukraine, stand me in good stead there. The silly things about keeping a kit together, don't get out more kit than you need, put everything away, zip everything up. It's basic stuff, but it's still as helpful now as it was 20 odd years ago.
And it's interesting that you have not a limited training, but your training differs from the regulars, because actually a bullet can't tell the difference.
No.
And that's the fact. And we as a nation, I mean, and we're seeing it now, certainly with the issues that are coming across the world, we haven't got that standing army. We haven't got the support with the reservists or the former TA, because people aren't joining up in the same way that they were back then. When I was in the regular in the police service, a number of people went on to join the TA reserve. Some are still in there, and it's a very credible and commendable activity, because without the reservists, the army or the military full stop would struggle.
They would indeed. I mean, I was watching, I don't know whether you've seen it, there's Peter Jackson, the guy that did Lord of the Rings and all that stuff. He did a First World War film, which I can't remember the name of, but he basically took footage from the First World War and digitized it,
right,
and then put it at a speed so it looks modern, if that makes sense. It really does. But one of the things, he has interviews with veterans who are obviously no longer with us now, but were taken, I think, in the 1970s. But one of the things that really stuck out to me, one of the veterans from the First War said that those people who'd been in the TA or had been Formula Regular, they formed the basis of the DS and training staff for what became sort of Kitchener's Army.
Yeah.
And, that required hundreds of thousands of soldiers to do that. And if we were called upon as a nation to mobilise to that level, we would still struggle to train, even using every single man, woman and child in the current forces. And what worries me 3 years into a major European war is that kind of hasn't been addressed, not just in the UK, but France, Germany, Poland, different. Poland, they are addressing it in a major, major way.
Yeah.
But others no, and that should be a huge concern.
But do you not think, I was reading last week that they've given the army recruiting contract to, I want to say Mighty, G4S, or one of those groups. You cannot possibly replace a recruiting sergeant in a shop front in Colchester or wherever it may be, because actually when you walk in, you want to talk to somebody that's actually done it.
Yeah.
Yes. And unless the person that they've employed is a former member of the military, then credibility has gone out of the window straight away with the recruiting system.
Yes. And it's that whole thing of the guidance that those career officers gave as well, because it's very often that experience assessment of someone walking in off the street that can change a whole career pattern for someone wanting to join any of the forces or services. And that can't be done in the way that recruitment's being done now. You can't get that knowledge meeting right. I could see where this bloke's coming from. He wants to join the paras, but maybe it's better if we guide him towards the engineers or para engineers.
Yep.
All that level of knowledge and sophistication, it just doesn't happen. You're right.
No, absolutely. So I'm going to take you back one. Where were you from originally in the UK? Were you a South London lad?
No, so I was born. Where is it now? It's in Greater Manchester now, but I was born it was Cheshire then, in a place called Bowden, which is near Altrincham in Cheshire. Went to school down in Gloucestershire, so near Cheltenham. Actually, it's not in Cheltenham. But in terms of the UK, I spent most of my adult life in London. You suddenly realise that, that's where you spent most of your life. But having said that, last 9 years in Poland. So it's been a bit of a mishmash.
Why didn't you join the regulars? Why was the regular service not something that you fancied?
It was an interesting one. I did want to join the regulars, and at the age of 19 went to do RCB, as it was called, Regular Commissions Board, which was based at Westbury, which is in Wiltshire. And I don't know what I did there. I don't think I did anything wrong, but I remember my report came back basically saying, don't bother us again.
No.
But what was very strange was, after I did my tour of Iraq, I don't want to sound bitter and twisted here, but my confidential report said, would Corporal Blackburn ever consider putting himself forward for officer training?
No.
And I don't know whether it was a confidence thing, age 19, probably was, but it was definitely something I wanted to do as a teenager, but probably wasn't ready to do at that stage. And if I had my time again, if I'm brutally honest, and this was advice I did have, somebody said to me, what you should have done after RCB was join up in the ranks, do a 3-year service for the colours, and then see how you feel. That would have been a much better way of doing things. But yes, it was one of those things that you think, yes, shouldn't have any regrets. But if I did have my time again, I think if the same thing happened with RCB, I would join up as a regular soldier, and then see what I wanted to do after 3 years and take it from there. So yeah, it was a shame really, but
Yeah.
I suppose partly that's why I joined the TA, to kind of scratch that itch, if that's the right phrase.
No, that makes sense. When you go to the TA, how did they let you know that you were being deployed overseas, that you were going to go to Basra?
They were very, very honest and upfront about it. First of all, they actually said, look, you all know what's happening in the news. You all know kind of the gathering storm. If you do not wish to be mobilised, now is the time to hand your kit in. And there were people who had family commitments and all sorts of things that handed their kit in, and there were, well-worn cliche, there were no names, no pack drill. I think people understood that things were changing. Then when it came to actual mobilisation, there was a first tranche, which were the most experienced lot, that went actually on Telic 1, the actual ground invasion. Second Telic lot, and then us. The way it was built up was they pretty much said over an evening, right, you need to start squaring away personal issues, banking issues, mortgage, all that sort of stuff. You need to start preparing kit and getting yourselves fitter than you are, because you'll need to be that bit fitter. And then talked us through what would happen, which was effectively there would be at some stage in the next 3 months a formal call up, and the classic brown envelope arrives. And I'll never forget opening that. It because I'd sort of, like we all do, you sort of half were expecting it, half forgot about it. Came back from work one day, and there it was on the mat. Opened it up, and it said, "You will report to Chilwell Barracks at such and such a date. Failure to report will result in a contravention of the Mobilisation Act 1996." It was fairly sort of draconian. And yeah, once received that, there was a whole package I had to hand to HR at work. They absolutely loved it. I remember HR, bless them, it was obviously something they'd never done before, so they were really excited. It was like a challenge, they had to kind of switch off the pension and plug into the MOD, and they loved it. That was all sorted, formally kept my civilian job open, and then it was turn up at the gate on the day, jump on the bus, went to Chilwell. From Chilwell, there was, what was really interesting was it was that classic sort of military thing of on paper it's all very serious, but when you get there it's handled very well, hugely efficient, processing everybody. We then did some training following on from mobilisation. We did training at Grantham at the old barracks there.
Yeah.
And that was absolutely excellent, because they brought people back who'd just done a tour. So we were, particularly on the medical side, a lot of training there. On the NBC side, or CBRN as it became. And then we were deployed to our unit that we were joining, regular unit in Germany. So we were then bused to Senelager. The only problem was that our unit had already deployed. So we arrived at Senelager, I remember, with nobody there to look after us, bar the sort of rear party. And then they were desperately trying to get us on a transport to get out to Iraq. And then within about a week of that, we did more training in Germany, then out to Iraq. Arrived in Iraq, and then the unit had been on the ground for a few weeks, and we're already fairly salty. So it's that, as you will know from your own experience, there's that sort of horrible thing of joining a unit that's already been doing the job and are quite sort of switched on, and you've kind of got to catch up. We were very lucky because as part of the unit I joined, which was the Rover Group unit, effectively being the sort of armoured taxi service for our commanding officer, we had a couple of guys who were from the CP element of RMP. And I can remember a particular staff sergeant sort of watching us being the TA people, and kind of going, right, accelerated training. And he, over the course of kind of learning on the job, over the course of probably only about 4 or 5 days, he took our weapon handling skills from sort of average to being actually pretty good, and then driving skills and everything else. And I think, looking back on that, it sounds a bit dramatic to say, but I think that was probably life-saving for everyone in the Rover Group, just having that extra knowledge and extra confidence. It made a very big difference when we were out on the ground. But it was a long answer to your question. It was actually a very well conducted process mobilization, right through to joining the unit in Iraq itself. And same with demobilization, but that's probably another question.
That's another question, but I'm just going to take you back a little bit. So you've taken a commercial flight, I would imagine, to Cyprus, or a military flight to Cyprus.
Yes.
And then you would have jumped on a Hercules to do the final bit from Cyprus to Basra?
Actually, no, we did on the way back. But at that stage, this would be October of 2003. It was a commercial aircraft, not an airline. It was obviously hired by the military, but had been a commercial aircraft. And we flew directly to Basra Airport.
Did you?
I think while we were there, the threat level went from relatively stable to quite high, and certainly by the time we left, there was completely different skills and drills for, when we arrived, there was still White Fleet driving around Basra. Right. I mean, it within 3 or 4 weeks that rapidly stopped, but yes, it was a little bit more laid back at the very beginning of the tour. By the end, it was completely different.
Did you? How did you feel though? So you're coming into land. You know that there's a conflict taking place below you. What were your feelings like, and the general feelings of the people around you?
I think I remember thinking, right, this is very real. I know that's almost a cliche, and sort of switch on. And we were fortunate because a lot of the people on the plane were regulars, and so any kind of TA, this is, look what we're doing what it all put a bit of a dampener on that. And then I remember we were just ushered straight into what was the terminal. Actually was quite a nice terminal at Basra Airport, or had been. And then the unit were there to meet us, and it felt very, very real very quickly. And yes, there was a feeling of, better not mess around. This is serious. We need to focus. And sort of, it was such a culture shock that I think it wasn't fear as such. It was more fear of not doing the right thing rather than fear of violence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because you've got your peers around you who've done it all before, and all of a sudden you're thrown into that theatre, aren't you? And that's what it is.
Yes.
My connection with all of this is I was in the police in Colchester, and my dad was a military policeman. And
right.
So and I've got quite a good working knowledge of it, because I was an honorary member of the Sergeant's Mess at Colchester at 156. And when the guys got killed out there, I raised about £3,000 with the rest of the guys on my major investigation team for the memorial. So that's why I'm quite nosy, and I'm very interested. So I would probably know who the sergeant was on the CP side. I've got a lot of friends who are former corps that did the CP training, etc.
The CP guys, fascinating, because I always remember when we were with them, they were well known at that stage at Basra Palace. There were all sorts of semi-sneaky beaky people around, and you got a sort of sense of who was doing what. But I always remember that two particular individuals from the CP side were, you could tell they were very well known and very well respected by everybody who was in that sort of higher echelon military qualifications. And it was always good to be with them, because you sort of by default you kind of got a bit of glory rubbed off on you when it was completely undeserved, but
Did you have many engagements whilst you're out there? Did you against the enemy?
Not ourselves, no. When we were out on the ground, there was all sorts of nastiness going on, but Rover Group was a interesting group of people, because the theory was, and the doctrine disappeared, I think, once particularly Iraq and Afghanistan got really, really kinetic. Theory was it was 2 snatch Land Rovers, 4 people plus commander, and we would just escort him going around the various locations where RMP were located in Basra and the AOR. And normally, the moment we got to somewhere, we'd be in a compound. So I was only thinking about this the other day, actually. There was the Bath Party headquarters had an RMP detachment there, which is another part of Basra. And we arrived there one day, and it just sounded like the biggest battle in the world was going on outside. And there's that thing of, should we be helping, getting involved? And it's that strange thing of, no, your job is to stay with the vehicles. You know, if you're needed, you'll be called upon. And there's that strange sort of demarcation where you can sort of see infantry guys running around walls and someone running past you with 200 rounds of link or whatever. And you think, I don't like this feeling of standing around, but that was our job. There was one incident I always remember where, and funnily enough, this has followed me to Ukraine in terms of don't say what you're thinking. There was we were coming back from, we had operational stand down. There was a lovely location in Kuwait, which was run by the Americans, where people who perhaps had R&R quite a few weeks ago would go for 3 or 4 days just to get a bit of a rest. We were coming back, and there was a place on the spot map, which I think was Green 3, as it was known, and we were stopped there, and I remember saying to the guy next to me on top cover, I bet you we get hit now. And the moment I said that, I remember watching a sort of what looked like a sort of orange firework heading towards us, and then snapping across the top of us, and then hearing, not over the net, but actually verbally, one of the guys on top cover in the other vehicle saying, you know, let's get out of here. It's like contact, wait out, going out on the net. We were zooming down a road at crazy speeds, only to be told on the net that the bridge we were heading towards had a suspected IED. And we had a very young officer with us, and I remember she was absolutely superb, because in the dark, with the map, with your PRR comms, with your wider net comms and everything else, and chitter chatter, I remember thinking, actually, you know, I'm glad I don't have the map, because I'm not sure I could do this, which is maybe one of the reasons why I didn't get through RCB, if I'm brutally honest with myself. But we managed to get back to the to Basra Palace, which was our base, and then we went to POL vehicles. And I remember chatting with the corporal, who was sort of head of, he always seemed to be on the fuel duties when we fueled up vehicles, and he was saying, gosh, he goes, I've just heard there's a call sign that's just been contacted. Have you heard about that? And we were like, yes, it was us. It was us. But that was the only major contact we had. We often had, say often, that's not, compared to subsequent tours, it wasn't often, but we had IDF coming into our compound, and it was usually just when you'd gone to sleep. I remember once IDF came into the compound, and there was a wonderful Scottish corporal in Rover Group who was doing ops room that night, and our colour sergeant phoned down to him and said, are you okay, anything to report? And he famously said, yes, they've spilt my tea, which which he was genuinely upset about, because he knew he'd have to. But, and it sounds funny laughing about all these things, but they shouldn't be happy memories, but they're sort of, they are and they aren't.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Same with But it was, and the things we saw, there were, I mean, some unpleasant things, but you just saw what a country that's really in free fall can look like, and just how bad things can get, and that was quite sobering, because you often realize that the only thing that was keeping you safe was you. I remember one night we stopped. We were heading out to the airport, as it was called, and we saw a guy. It looked like he was being robbed. He was being robbed, and so we thought, well, we are RMP. We should stop and help. So we stopped and helped. And I remember the robber ran away, but the bloke who was being robbed ran towards us and basically said, "You guys have got to get out of here. Get out of here now." And we sort of said, "Well, we're here to help you." And this guy said, "Just get out of here." And he was off. And I remember what we then discovered was there was a tribe called the Guremshir tribe, I think, based in southern Iraq, and they were robbing fuel from nearby from the garage.
Right.
And what we'd seen, and it's always the way with these things, what we'd seen was just a bloke who was an offshoot of this gang robbing someone at the civilian garage, not realizing there was a whole load of them robbing from the fuel dump. So we then found ourselves in a really sticky situation. And I remember on the comms there was a sort of button you pushed when it was almost like, the only push this in case of emergencies. And that's what crashed out the quick reaction QRF, quick reaction force. And I remember the moment that happened, we could hear them coming from another location in Basra. And I remember that, and this is probably one of my most frightening moments. I remember thinking, are they going to get to us before the bad guys get to us? And it was, I can't really remember how it all panned out, how close it was, but I remember one of the warrior vehicles passing. It must have only been within about a foot of my boots, and just feeling so relieved as this thing roared past and then just dealt with the bad guys. It was very, very strange, sort of half memories of these things, all kind of wrapped up in adrenaline. It's Sorry, I'm rambling on here.
No, it's absolutely perfect. How long were you out there?
6 months. 6 month tour, which I think is the standard tour that the British Army do in any operational environment.
How did you deal with people being killed? Because every day somebody was fatally wounded, from a different regiment or wherever. How did you deal with that as a territorial army?
We were in many ways, as Rover Group, we just did our own thing every day. There's ways that we'd be aware of someone losing their lives. It was usually the SIB element of RMP would be called out, so we'd be aware that they were going out. And then there would be what they called Op Minimize, where any comms out of Iraq were shut down, mainly so that the families would find out first from the military rather than from the news or anything else. But we were very lucky on that tour. We did have other RMP members who were injured, but not from our Rover Group, which was based in Basra. They were based up in Al-Qurna. We had one of the RMP from another unit was injured in a sort of street. It was weird. They were actually injured by a rock, of all things, but very badly injured. But when there were other losses in other units, it was mainly just hearing about it, either by knowing that SIB were going out to deal with the forensics and everything else that was around that, and Op Minimize, it was called, to shut down the comms itself. Yeah,
because the SIB only had a very limited amount of time to do crime scene investigation, collect what was left if it was an IED, get the body back for repatriation. So it was quite a stressful role for them. I know people that have undertaken that role, and it was quite and it's taken its toll on some of the people involved in that element. When you come to the conclusion of your tour, how did you feel when they said, right, well, that's it, your 6 months is done. There's your Hercules, now on your way. Thank you very much for your help. How did you feel?
I remember just before we went back, Nasiriyah was about to fall. The Italians, it wasn't the Italians' fault. The Italians were based in Nasiriyah. But there was something to do with the Italian government not allowing or not changing the rules of engagement. And we were actually told, right, you guys are being held back because there's always this strange moment where the new tour comes in, old tour is still there. And effectively, you've kind of got double the numbers. And I guess the British military thought, right, we've got double the numbers here. We can really go and do something. And for about 2 days, we were sort of basically told that your home time is put on hold. Then that sort of evaporated and everything came good. And then it was straight back to the airport. Strange memory. We handed everything back in terms of a lot of the issue kit. I just remember the big pile of body armor. It was getting bigger and bigger, and just dekitting of rounds. And the weird thing, there was a weird rule about weapons and how they can be transported. Just as an aside, sorry, jumping around a bit here. On our way out to Germany when we were mobilised, I'm not quite sure how this got squared away, but it's a funny little memory I have. All our weapons were put in Hessian sacks. There were 2 Hessian sacks with our rifles in.
Right.
And we were actually on the Harwich to Hook of Holland ferry.
Oh, wow.
And I remember getting in the lift, if you've ever taken that ferry. It's quite a big ferry. And myself and another colleague were in the lift. I had a Hessian bag. He had a Hessian bag. And there was a lovely old boy in there. And he says, what on earth have you got in there? And my colleague remembers saying, he said, you wouldn't believe it if I told you. And he said, you've not got guns in there, have you? And we were like, oh. but on the way back, I remember traveling with there was a funny rule about you couldn't have the bayonet separate from the rifle because the bayonet was part of the weapon system, but you were allowed personal knives because they weren't part of the weapon. It was one of these weird bureaucratic things which I remember being very annoying. But came back to Nottingham, to Chilwell, to be demobilised, and it was very, very quick, and that probably was not handled so well, in the sense that we arrived back, we flew from Basra by Hercules to Kriteri in Cyprus, not Syria. From there we went back to the UK. Brize Norton we landed at, and crazy thing is, all these things you've got me remembering now. My parents live about 20 miles from Brize Norton, and I remembered we virtually, I could have gone out and gone to see Mum on the bus on the way out to Nottingham, but obviously that couldn't be allowed. It was a sort of sealed bus. We weren't allowed off until we were demobilised. Did a huge amount of paperwork in a very short space of time. Handed the rifles back, did a sort of inspection and whatever, and were then basically said, right, you can either go home now or go home the next day. And I don't know why, but we all wanted to go home, but I think it would have been much better if we just had a sort of final evening together. But myself and the guys who were London bound, we found ourselves still in desert combats, arriving at Paddington on the sort of last train. Where is it from? We would we got a train from Nottingham to Birmingham, Birmingham to Paddington. That was it. Or Birmingham to Euston, I think. And we arrived at Euston, and it was sort of what just happened. And we had then post-tour leave for, I think it was 6 weeks. And yeah, adjusting was quite odd. Not least a little bit of jet lag, but also just the volume being turned down. You know, you realise the adrenaline levels are at a level that you really have to manage. And I know that often for people in the police service that can be very similar. That it's very hard to modulate adrenaline.
Yeah, it is. But you see, I suppose the difference with the police is it's, you know, we'll be working in our local areas, go home and you deal with it. It has a different sort of ramification. So you had no decompression in Cyprus. You literally came straight back to the UK.
We did, and I have memories of one of the regular people, seniors, saying to us, I think this demobilisation is not a good idea. Why don't you come back to Germany with the rest of the unit and go through our decompression program, which was, you know, canoeing and rock climbing or whatever it might be, but go through that and then demobilise. But it was this weird situation where while the tour was on, we were under their control. But the moment the tour was over, we were sort of handed off back to the demobilisation people, and they sort of had control. But I think it would have been a lot better for us and the regular guys, because they were our mates by that stage, obviously, to decompress together. And I think suffered is perhaps too strong a word, but I think some people struggled for, I know I did, for probably 6 or 7 months afterwards, not in any sort of cataclysmic way, but just kind of turning the volume down, you know, and finding a level.
The decompression element is part of the process. And in years to come, there was a decompression zone in Cyprus. So the units would go to Cyprus, they'd have stand-up comedians, they'd have bands, all that. And they'd sit there and drink, and, you know, they'd have a couple of beers, not a huge amount. But that was the difference. Whereas the early tours, there was none of that. You were literally back into your almost back in Civvy Street. I mean, 6 weeks is quite a hefty lump of leave, but then you're sitting there dwelling about what you were doing the previous 6 months.
Yes. Yeah, it's actually, it probably would have been better to go, strange enough, to go straight back to work rather than sitting around. And actually, some wiser people did. I think they just thought, no, it's best to get into something again. But yes, there were a lot of lessons learned, I think, about managing post-tour activities and helping people decompress, which is a good thing. Yeah,
absolutely. How long did you serve in the TA after the tour?
It was about 18 months.
Right.
I think one of the things I realised was that the tour situation was now part of the TA culture, and rightly so. You know, it's part of the military. And after I got back, so the same HR people were very supportive and sort of thrilled, but there was that kind of the way that HR do, and probably HR or whatever, sort of suggested that, you know, that maybe I'd done my bit and that it might not be beneficial to keep, or you could keep going away, but then it might not help career-wise, etc., etc. So,
yeah.
Excuse me, I thought it's either a case of doing more tours or got to sort of draw a line under it. And a lot of people did. I think for those sort of reasons, it wasn't some kind of throwing toys out the pram, you know, I'm not doing this again. It was a realization that, no, I've actually got to focus on whatever career they had. Conversely, one or two people actually joined up.
Oh, did they?
In fact, the guy I was telling you about who spilt his tea, or, you know, complained about it, he decided actually during the tour to join up. And I think managed, this is in the days for proper internet, sort of do all the paperwork via the unit admin, and he then rejoined the unit as a regular. So and I think he's just retired, done his 22 about a year or two ago.
You've signed off. How did you feel when you gave back your military ID and your DPM and anything else that you wanted to give back?
It's a little bit strange. I mean, I one of the things that I think, and a lot of people in the TA have found, that I think although that sort of post 9/11 environment, there were a lot of opportunities for tours and training, what have you. I think it also damaged a lot of units, not just RMP, but all TA units, because what you'd have is such a range of skills and people who'd sort of done incredible tours, being potentially ordered around by people who hadn't gone away for whatever reason. And I think that created all sorts of weird wobbles in terms of respect and everything else. I remember being on a training weekend where the chef, who I think had some sort of legendary moment, I think it was in Afghanistan, had basically had to jump on a GPMG and fired hundreds of rounds of link while whatever happened. There was some sort of instruction going on about how to deploy a GPMG, and have vague memories of him kind of making a helpful suggestion and kind of being told to shut up because he's only a slop jockey sort of thing, and thinking, yeah, this is the problem. He's actually had 6 months in a horrible FOB with very little sort of support and what have you, being told by somebody who may well have done the GPMG instruction course but had never actually fired the thing in anger. How is this all reconciled within a sort of unit of very mixed abilities? And I think it created a strange environment in the TA. And so when it came to handing sort of kit in, it wasn't a wrench. It was just kind of drawing a line, really. And then there was no sort of animosity or anything. It was a very, thanks and see you at the Christmas drink sort of thing. It was very, very laid back.
Amicable. It's interesting because Simon Maloney is somebody who I've interviewed, and he got the last CGC in Afghanistan, and he actually left the military because he was being instructed by somebody who hadn't been in theatre, hadn't been shot in the neck by the opposition, hadn't killed anybody and he just said, I'd had enough of it by then. So you're now out, you're back into your civilian role. Move it forward, you're now living in Poland. You've written a book and you're doing some great work with the Ukraine. I mean, I'll tell you my story about the region that you're in, Sopot, Gdansk, Gdynia. I worked on the murder of a man called Rafael Konrad Chapchik, who was a sailor from that region. He was murdered in Essex, and it took us some time to identify him simply because he hadn't been reported missing at that time by his mother. We never identified his killers. We identified some people, but we never brought any people to justice. So that's how I know that particular area. We had officers backwards and forwards to that part of Poland. But how did you end up in Poland?
My wife is Polish, and what happened was both my wife's grandmother and mother got very ill at the same time. And it just became easier to be in Poland, sorting out the sort of care and what have you. And because I work in software, spoke to colleagues and said, look, can I effectively work from home? It was just at the time when working from home was very possible, but obviously pre-COVID, so it wasn't a massive thing. And they said, well, look, do it as long as you're back for meetings and so on and so forth. And weirdly, thanks to budget airlines, it was and still is very easy to get back to the UK. And there was one moment where we had a potential customer up in Aberdeen, and it was both easier and cheaper for me to fly from Gdansk to Aberdeen and back again in the day than it was from someone to come up from the south of England. And so it kind of worked very, very well. And course, our place in the UK was rented out, and sadly, both my wife's grandmother and mother had passed away. So there was that moment when we thought about going back. But then our place is rented out. We were sort of quite happy here, and it's a lovely place by the sea.
Yeah.
So we thought, well, we're here, and one year there, you're there. And then, of course, Ukraine kicks off, the major invasion.
Yeah.
And suddenly we find ourselves in a town where refugees are arriving. And that was very strange. Funny enough, I'm always very slow on the uptake with these things. I remember 2 days after the invasion, walking up our road where there's a little passport photo shop. Bloke does excellent passport photos, better than the machines or whatever. And there was a queue of people outside, and I thought, I've never seen, what on earth is going on? So walked past up to the shops, and I was thinking, is it? And then on the way back, the queue was even bigger, and I realised, they're all Ukrainians. They're getting temporary ID photos. Then walked through we sort of live next to a nice little park, and I was walking through to meet up with the owner of a local cafe, who now is our sort of local councillor, because he'd said we need to meet up because we've got to do something to help. He's kind of galvanising people. And in the park there were just loads of people sitting on benches. There were women crying into phones, and I'm thinking, what on earth is going on? And then again, it's refugees. The people are arriving.
Yeah.
Went to have the chat with Michal, who runs the cafe. He said, look, I'm sort of gathering food and sort of civilian type stuff. He said, what can you do to help? And I said, well, we'll gather stuff. And we went up to the depot they'd set up. It was a sort of deserted council building they were using. And while we were there, one of the sort of real organisers said, look, can I have a word with you? And I said, yeah, sure. And she said, what they really need is military kit. They need boots, they need helmets, clothing. You were in the TA. I know you're in the sort of Army Reserve. Do you have any of that sort of stuff handy? Thinking I had a sort of
an armory
quartermastership. But my wife, who was standing alongside me, she pipes up and says, you've got loads of stuff in the cellar. I know you have. And I was like, no, I haven't. I don't think I've got anything anymore. I handed it all back, as just said. Anyway, she goes, right, we're going home. I'll go and dig it out. And as always, she's right. And sure enough, it was about 4 boxes of extra stuff I bought in the TA. You want to get the best sort of Gore-Tex and so we gathered all this stuff together. I even found my sort of Gucci Bergen that I bought myself, put all the stuff in the Bergen, turned up at the refugee centre, and they were like, wow, this guy's, he's really got the military stuff. Handed it all over, and the lady says, look, she took me around to one side, because I think she was aware there were almost that sort of, the walls have ears, careless talk costs lives sort of thing. And she said, look, can you get hold of any more of this sort of kit? And I was like, maybe. And then I thought, hang on, if I speak to people I was in the TA with, and other people they know, and people I know from other units, and people I'd worked with who ex-regular, maybe we can gather something together. Anyway, I did that. I put out also a message on a website called the Army Rumour Service, which I don't know whether you've heard of, but came back lots of messages all of a sudden. Where do we send it to? Now, strangely enough, the people who are renting our place in London, it was a Polish guy with his Ukrainian girlfriend. So I thought, hang on a second, they can act as our sort of depot, because I was only really expecting a handful of stuff. But no, it was quite a bit was promised. So I rang them and said, can I use you as the depot? And of course she was thrilled because, you know, she wanted to do as much as she could. And that lasted for about a week. I got a phone call from our Ukrainian tenant saying, Will, when are you coming to collect this stuff? And I said, well, how are you doing? And she sort of showed me with her phone what looked like sort of Indiana Jones's warehouse, but crammed into a small London flat. Please, can you come and... So we had to get hold of somebody. In the end, it was the person, the company that helped us move over to Poland. And they very graciously said, look, we'll fill our vans, the spaces in our vans, with stuff for Ukraine. That worked very well until it just got to the point where too much stuff was arriving. Transferred the depot to my parents' garage over in Gloucestershire. Following on from that, I'm sorry, I know it's a very long answer again. The charity said, look, you need to deal with the guy that's directly going to the units in Ukraine. And they introduced me to Igor Trach, who's this sort of Bear Grylls type, sort of Polish Bear Grylls type person. And we started directly giving the kit to him. And then at the end of the first year, at the end of 2022, Igor came round for some Christmas cake and came round with his wife. And he just sort of said, look, Will, you've done quite a bit for us. Do you want to come over on a convoy, help with a bit of driving and see what we're doing? And that was a bit of needle across the record moment, because I thought, oh, that's a bit of a step up. And so December of 22 went on first convoy over to Ukraine, and, you know, big old 6,000 kilometer round trip from Poland, and then have done subsequent trips since then. And just, it's been incredible to see, particularly obviously the east of Ukraine, the Donbass. I was telling someone yesterday, you know, being different units, learning incredible things about just, you know, the scale of the war, scale of what they're having to endure, and also the scale, talking about mobilization before, the scale of mobilization there, just incredible numbers of people involved. And, you know, it goes without saying, we've not really seen this level of war for 80 years, certainly not in Europe. And just the level of innovation. I was telling someone yesterday, I was very privileged last summer to spend a day with a drone unit, and just to see what a science project it is. You know, drones go out, data comes back straight into the laptops, straight to the 3D printers. Right, you know, if we take 3 mil off this fin here, we add another, you know, 5 grams of C4 or whatever to the bomblet, and it's you know, the speed at which they're learning and how hospitable they are as well. You know, it's this crazy thing of I didn't realize until after that meeting how close we were to what's called the zero line. We were only 3 kilometers from the zero line at that stage. Yeah, it was a bit scary.
Yeah, I bet it was scary. And there's, you know, great people like you that are undertaking. I interviewed a guy that was shipping stuff from Canada. You know, it's unbelievable of money in Ukraine. But what's the general consensus in Ukraine around these changes with American politics in particular?
You know, it's interesting, because I think what Ukraine is doing now in terms of its own armament is it's about 1/3 of the armaments it uses, it manufactures itself, and that's growing. They have a huge industrial base. But anecdotally, and it is only anecdotally, what I sort of sense is that the likes of Poland, Finland, the Baltics, Scandinavia, and also the UK as well, have kind of sort of said, okay, if, and it's still an if, because the civilian aid is being cut to Ukraine, but the military aid from the States hasn't actually been stopped yet. If that was to happen, we've got this. You know, Poland has a huge industrial base. The Czech Republic does. Finland, for its size, just produces a scary amount of weapons.
Oh, yeah.
And the other thing, the flip side of that, and this is something I've come to realize after living in Poland for nearly 9 years, just over 9 years, sorry, now, is this is a very different thing for them. They have been living with the nightmare of Russia. They've been Ukraine, the Baltics, Finland, Poland for 500 years. And I think it's almost, we're not going to put up with this anymore. It's a silly analogy in a way, but I use the analogy of I remember many years ago, I was about 18, first going to a pub, and there was a local pub, and there was a bloke in there who used to throw his weight around and sort of always be mouthing off at people, and everyone was terrified of him. And it was sometimes if he's in there, we wouldn't even go in. Anyway, one day he was picking on a young lad, and I remember this. I can see it now. This young lad comes out of the gents, and this big guy starts yelling at him and whatever. And this young lad runs over and absolutely whacks him. I mean, terrible whack. And at that moment, a load of other people piled in. Now, the rights and wrongs of that at the time, we can debate. But as an analogy, I get that sense that Russia is that big bloke in the pub mouthing off.
Okay.
And Ukraine are the guy that's gone and whacked. And I think if Russia's not very careful, they may find there's a whole lot of other people who, once the opportunity arises, come and, rightly or wrongly, join in. And I remember that bloke. The weirdest thing as well was that bloke never really came in the pub again. He was finished. And I think Russia at the moment are doing this very good job of beating their chests and broadcasting. But the simple truth is that they can't do anything. And they haven't been able to do anything for 3 years now. And Ukraine have formed a seawall.
Yeah.
It is utterly horrible. There are terrible stresses and strains for Ukrainian military, but they are holding them. And Russia talks about this and talks about that, but they can't go on forever, Russia. And that's when it goes, it's going to go big.
See, my concern is if we don't stand up to Russia as a collective, we will be next. And I get it that, if you go to the eastern side of Russia, they're only 20 miles away from Alaska or whatever it may be. But the impact on the USA is minimal compared to the rest of us. I still see that we're part of Europe. Once if they roll through Ukraine, then they'll roll through Poland. Poland went through that in 1939. It would just go, and we're only 3 countries, away. If you look at it in real terms, in geographical terms, 3 or 4 countries between us and Russia. So, yeah, we've got to. I do get some of the rhetoric with Trump about the contributions into NATO. I do understand that because actually, there needs to be more balance and people doing it. But you know what? We've got lovely Americans living in this country that are RF Lake and Heath and Building Hall. It's not only their war. It's not only their issue. We're all in this together. And I think that's lost. I know some of my American friends, I don't know why we're supporting Ukraine. Well, I do. But then, no disrespect, but it took them a long time to come to the Second World War. They wouldn't have come to the Second World War had Pearl Harbor not taken place.
Yes. So I think your point about the contributions is very important. And I don't want to make a Brexit point here, but one of the last Saturday evening, someone mentioned about Brexit, which is fine. But I said, something about Europe that does concern me, Europe being the EU, is after 3 years of an unmistakably massive war, that the level of commitment to defence in Europe, the phrase I used on Saturday evening was, how much does the EU love itself if it's only spending the same amount of money it was pretty much before the war started? That wasn't perhaps the most diplomatic way of putting it, particularly as Poland are actually spending a lot now on defence.
Yeah, they are.
But the question still stands. It is a mystery to me how at this stage we're about to enter the 4th year of the war, and some EU countries hardly talk about it. It's bizarre.
Well, they're almost in denial.
Yes,
they are honestly almost in denial. I don't understand why. But anyway, so what was the inspiration for you to become an author, and what is your book about, sir?
So what happened was, you remember I mentioned before the company I was working for, and it ended up, I was published a book. So software company I worked for, the chap who was the big boss, his background actually had been publishing, and there's that whole area where publishing and publishing software sort of meets. It's the theoretically, yes, of course, you're some of the social media platforms who say they're not publishers, but we won't go there. I was always stayed in touch with him, and he knew I'd been going to Ukraine, and we'd met up one day. My wife and myself were overseeing family and sorting out some Ukraine donations, and he said, meet up with us, sort of tell us how you are and what's happening. And had a nice lunch, and we were chatting away about this, that, and everything. And he said, look, he goes, I'll put something to you. He goes, can you write? And I first of all, was I literate? And I was like, well, he goes, no. I can, put. And he says, write up what you're doing. Write up the convoys. And he goes, I run a little publishing imprint. It's not Penguin, so don't get too excited. But if I think it's worth publishing and it could find an audience, let's see how we go. So did a couple more convoys, wrote it all up, and I sort of kind of did the classic thing of say what you see sort of thing, and kept it sort of slightly light-hearted, and occasionally it's not light-hearted, but a kind of reportage. Sent it to him, and he said, okay, we're on. He goes, I'll be your publisher if you want me to. And then we did a sort of proper contract and all that sort of stuff. Book was published in March of last year. And it's to be honest, it's not sold millions or anything like that at all, but it has sold. And funnily enough, I got a little notification from Amazon just before the last weekend saying that it was number 2 in the most gifted book in military travel, which is the category that it's in, which I thought was quite amusing. But and it's had some very nice reviews. It's been because I never thought in my wildest dreams I'd end up writing about anything, let alone writing a book.
What's it called? You've spoken about the book. What's it called?
It's called The War Next Door.
The War Next Door.
The War Next Door, and that comes from on the very day that Ukraine invaded, the big invasion. We were watching all the news channels as everybody did, and I said to my wife, everything has changed now, particularly as we're only 30 kilometers from Kaliningrad ourselves. And she said, without meaning to rhyme, she said, yes, we have a war next door now. We have a war next door. And I remember at the time, it just stuck in my head. And then when Francis, publisher, said, you need a title, I was like, ooh, and I was thinking, driving in Ukraine or something banal like that. And then it came back to me, the war next door. So that's...
Well, the link for your book will be in the body of the text for this podcast. So anything else that you want to send me, any social media stuff, LinkedIn, etc., etc. If people want to send equipment, are you still collecting?
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. What I suggested to people is, if they want to send any equipment, contact me directly, and I will furnish them with the depot address. It's just a little bit of sort of OPSEC just to keep things relatively secure. But yes, anything they want to send. Maybe it's worth me sending you a kit list as well.
Please do.
I don't know whether that.
We'll put that on the body as well. Make sure that gets out there. What does the
Wonderful.
future look like? I mean, I assume you're going to stay out in Poland forever and ever, amen?
Yes, I mean that's a very good question. I think the war, certainly in relation to helping Ukraine, the group of us, and it's a great group of people now that go with Igor to Ukraine. We are committed until victory, until Ukraine wins, or until, very worst case, until Ukraine is stabilized. And after that, there will probably be a huge reconstruction phase as well. So probably is the wrong word. There will be a huge construction phase. So we will be out here in Poland for a considerable amount of time, both personally in terms of living here and enjoying living here, but also because it's a great staging post to help Ukraine and to help continue their efforts.
How easy was it to make the transition across there?
In the early days, do you mean in terms of crossing borders and?
Yeah, for you to move out there. I mean, how easy did you find that? I mean, accepting that your other half is Polish, how were you accepted?
It's interesting. The Tri-City area is it's very good because it's basically 3 ports or 2 ports and a tiny little fishing port. As all ports are, they're quite accepting of all sorts of different people. So it's cosmopolitan in that way. Admin-wise, it's everything is. The funny thing is that everything is very much the same these days. And I was even thinking this earlier today with the banking apps. My banking app in the UK is obviously the same banking app as the bank in Poland, with just slightly different branding. And as with all globalized world, a lot of things are pretty much the same day to day. Admin side of things can be very different when it comes to more important things like property and that sort of stuff. The biggest drama with admin actually came after Brexit, and that was a little bit of toing and froing, which is all. If you can avoid Polish bureaucracy, then don't touch it. I have to say, when I hear people getting very upset about bureaucracy in the UK, when it comes to government stuff, whether it be paying taxes or registering things, the UK is incredibly slick and very easy, very user friendly, and that may be a shock for people listening in the UK. But
to be honest with you, but yeah, I do understand what you mean. I can't believe that you're only 30 miles or kilometers from Leningrad.
Sorry, Kaliningrad.
Oh,
Kaliningrad. It's this strange exclave that, after the fall of the Soviet Union, wasn't part of Poland and wasn't part of the Baltic states, and I guess the Russian Federation hung on to it. It's a kind of weird little oblast on its own, but of course now it's Russia's. It's one of Russia's only entry points into the Baltic, and it kind of sits there all on its own.
Very strategic.
Yes, but I think they. I wonder what the future of it will hold, because as Russia gets more and more desperate, it financially and economically, I wonder whether it makes sense for them, but we shall see. I remember last summer walking along the coast road, and 2 fast jets flew over my head at absolutely, I don't know what speed they were doing, and I couldn't tell you what the airframes were, but One was heading back, in my opinion, back in the direction of Russian airspace, and the other one carried on for a few seconds and then pulled away, I guess, on the edge of Polish airspace. And I can only think that a naughty Russian plane, I may be wrong, but a naughty Russian plane had flown over into Poland and was being told to go home.
Yeah.
But it is sobering that, yes, it is just it's Dover to Calais distance. We can see it across the Gulf of Gdansk, across the way. Yeah.
And I'm assuming it's cold there at the moment.
It is, but it's interesting. You talk to people who were living here 30, 40 years ago, and they'll tell you the sea used to freeze.
Yeah.
And now it doesn't. And it's -5 today, which, 20, 30 years ago would have been a warm winter's day. It used to be, yeah. But it is cold. Not as cold as Ukraine, which gets frighteningly cold.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Well, I've been to St. Petersburg, and I remember flying back over the Bay of, is it the Bay of Finland? I can't remember, but you could look out and that was frozen. That was really,
yeah.
And of course, you've got your own podcast as well, which is called
We'll Talk Military, which I've not done, to be honest, for 2 years.
Come on,
strange.
Man.
Well, because it started off as about veterans and army leavers. That was kind of the thought behind it. But somebody said, why don't you interview Ukrainian military and sort of turn it on its head? But the problem is that they don't have much time to speak, because often we're just handing over kit, and very often you don't want to be hanging around there too long. And the other is just I'm very aware of sort of personal security for them.
Yes.
Not that you have to use names and things, but other people are listening. I wouldn't want to drop them in it. One of the things that often people say is, we want more photos of this, that, and the other. And I'm saying I can't give you photos because there's too much in the photo that can potentially give away a location or whatever. So that's always a challenge as well.
Do you get the BBC out there? Do you bother with the BBC, or is it all?
Yeah, we do. The BBC's coverage of, a lot of people get very worked up about the BBC. It's, a lot, to use that well-worn phrase now, mainstream media. I think a lot of the mainstream media doesn't quite get a lot of things, and specifically to Ukraine, in my experience, they don't quite get it. I know the BBC do have people in Ukraine reporting, but I don't feel they're getting quite the accurate picture. There may be reasons for that, maybe operational reasons for that, but we've been on several occasions with journalists who come with us, and very often they are the only journalist that these soldiers have seen. I'm thinking, I know it's a huge front, but this is, again, without sounding horrible, it's in the good old days of Vietnam War or whatever, it was news gold having footage from the front line. But it's almost, whether it's an editorial decision or whether it's a budgetary decision, they just can't afford to have people in the field anymore. But it's a shame there isn't more English language coverage of what's happening.
Well, there's a great reporter called James Waterhouse who works for the BBC, who I know, and I also know he has been on the front line many times. He's absolutely brilliant. I did some stuff with him on the Victoria Derbyshire show. Anyway, so listen, I'm going to leave you to your day. Thank you so much for the time. I hope you've enjoyed this experience. I hope that it's been good for you. I've really enjoyed our chat. But before we conclude our interview, this is an old police saying, is there anything you'd like to add, alter, or correct in relation to the statement that you've made today?
No, I'd just like to thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to speak. I'm very honoured that you've asked me. Thank you for that. And I hope what I've said has been of interest, because I'm a terrible rambler, Paul, as you probably have gathered.
Absolutely perfect. So Thank you so much. Send my regards to your other half. Keep safe whilst you are crossing the borders and doing that brilliant work. And we are with you. We may not be with you physically, but, in spirit, we are with you. And we wish you and everybody out there the best of luck and success.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you.
God bless you, mate. Take care and keep in touch.
I will indeed. Cheers.
Been a pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
This episode is sponsored by LifeSafe Technologies' Stay Safe All-in-One Fire Extinguisher. Click on the link in the body of the text to buy your fire extinguisher today. Thank you for listening to this episode of X-Job Downloaded. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please like, follow and share. My other podcast, Lovies, A Life in Entertainment and Media, can be found on all platforms. Just Google Paul Maleary, Lovies, A Life in Entertainment and Media. Thank you.